Chairman.
Thank you for your questions, Mr. Hare. And just to set the record straight, the state of Wisconsin, DNR did what they were supposed to do in following their rules, but their rules weren't sufficient to cover the harm. I would quote one of my favorite justices of the Supreme Court, Hugo Black, who, during one of his rulings, it may have been a bar fight, I'm not sure, where he said, quote, "Sir, your freedom to swing ends where the other person's chin begins," close quote. And so when it comes to a source of pollution, their freedom to pollute our air, our water, and our soil ends where the other person's environment begins, be it internal or external. My question really has more to do with all three of you come from different regions of the United States, and you have a common problem. And that problem you feel, if I hear you correctly, is that our groundwater needs adequate protection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And yet there's an economic cost to this, because once the groundwater has become polluted, once an aquifer has become polluted or collapses altogether, it is very, very expensive, if not impossible, to bring it back to life, so to speak. So I'd like to hear your comments first, Mr. Kavanaugh, about how you think you can produce cleaner, healthier shellfish.
Pretty simple. You have to put some teeth in a watchdog. In my particular case, we already got bounced out of federal court once. In the additional documentation that I put into as part of my testimony, you'll find out that it was a very expensive study. It was done in Red Bank. Nowhere did they use the word point source. I mean, you got to give me. I'll fight the fight. We'll defend our families and our way of life. But you got to give me a law I can fight with. When I'm getting thrown out of federal court and nobody in the state's paying any attention to me, I only have the federal arena, and I'm willing to go to the federal arena. We're willing to defend our shores and our families. But if I can't, if I have no standing, because it's a colander, and you got to say which, you know, if everything is leaking sewage and antibodies, and you say, well, it's not a point source, then I got to go home.
Thank you, Mr. Kavanaugh. Ms. Butterfield, do you feel that the EPA has what it needs now in terms of the legislative authority to oversee and enforce the actions that are taking place in Washington and Montana?
Congressman Kagen, you spoke about the importance of prevention, and that once water is contaminated, it's extremely expensive to uncontaminate that water. That's why enforcement and resources for enforcement are key, so that when I drive on a highway and I see a highway construction project where the sediment and fumes and diesel are contaminating surface waters that will affect the water systems of people downstream, that people know that enforcement will be effective. The second thing would be stronger connections between local health departments about information and public awareness, so that people can make the connections between water contamination and public health as an issue, and strengthening that so that communities can work together. Thank you.
Ms. Treml, any remarks in that regard?
The only remark I have is just a clarification to Ms. Jackson. There was a question posed to her and to you as well, that in our case, the Clean Water Act was clearly violated when the manure ran off over the neighbor's property and into School Creek, which is a navigable waterway. It's the waters of the state. Our federal lawsuit got seated in federal court in April of 2004, and it was only 3 months later the state of Wisconsin decided to file its own lawsuit for violations of the Clean Water Act. So we did have the rules in place, so to speak, to have the DNR in the state of Wisconsin act on our water contamination claim, not our private drinking water claim. But what we found is that the state of Wisconsin became our adversaries versus our allies. When we were going toe-to-toe with DNR employees in depositions, rather than when they were becoming a hindrance to our case rather than a help, that was when we realized we had a problem in Wisconsin, and that other families in Wisconsin had a real big problem.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you again for appearing before the committee, and you have the full support of a majority of the members of this committee in taking actions to try and prevent further point source and non-point source pollutions.